Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. Bull and Ferrari may not be happy with the FIA's latest declaration after massive drama this season, especially coming out of McLaren with the FlexiWings saga that happened effectively all season long. The FIA have confirmed they plan to make zero changes to the way these regulations are ruled upon by the governing body of the sport. That means that McLaren and Mercedes, who use this technology quite extensively through the season, will not have to change all that much going into 2025. Ferrari, and especially Red Bull, they need to get to work fast on developing their more flexible front wings if they want any chance with competing with the opposition. Is this a good decision by the FIA? Are they simply not doing anything, as they always seem to do? Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new, as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Especially interesting, of course, because these FlexiWing discussions always go into the realms of illegal, legal, cheating, not cheating. The FIA say, well, it's fine. That obviously means something, although Red Bull might have other ideas. I did mention this the other day on Flavio Briatore's perspective on Jack Doohan. I just thought it was interesting because there was some more talk about it, because Jack Doohan's obviously driving the Alpine next year alongside Gasly. Briatore's basically already said if he doesn't deliver, he's going to be gone. And I do wonder whether that can ever end well for a driver. I think, like, if that is Briatore and Alpine's perspective, and it doesn't seem to be an especially healthy one, I'm not saying Briatore's wrong. I mean, Formula 1 isn't a charity. If you're not delivering, you're going to be out of the sport. That's how it should be, in my opinion. But equally, if the team and Briatore already have that mindset going into the season, I'm not sure what Doohan can do to change the mind, of course, unless he matches or surpasses Gasly, which would, of course, be a serious, impressive result if he was to do so. Quickly on Red Bull, I'm not sure if this is going to go anywhere, but Jurgen Klopp has recently joined Red Bull as their, head of global football, basically soccer, for those of you watching this States. And Helmut Marko, of course, chief advisor to the Formula 1 project, said the following, that he'd love to work with Klopp. I think there's definitely been more of a feeling in recent years of people who are, good motivators, good, managers of sports people, whatever, getting involved in other elements than the sports that they're necessarily well known for. So just thought it was interesting. I'm not saying there's anything in it, but Marco was talking about, well, maybe we bring in Klopp in some capacity to maybe help develop younger drivers. I don't know. It would be a very interesting one. But of course, I guess Marco, he's getting on a bit, isn't he, right? And he can't run that junior development program in Formula 1 forever. Of course, you've got to have someone with some serious racing background and pedigree to do it, but maybe Klopp could have some part to play in that, just because, let's be honest, if you look at the Red Bull Driver Academy over the last few years, they've not really produced many drivers that even they or anybody else rate especially highly. There's been so many drivers in their program, and good drivers at that, but they've dropped many drivers for various reasons. Not many have made it through the ranks, even this season, when they were talking about, okay, well, Perez is probably going to be gone, we're going to put somebody else in. Is Lawson really the guy that they would like him to be ideally? Possibly not. Is Hadjar the guy they would like to replace him at RB alongside Yuki? Probably not. Yuki seems the best option, but obviously they don't want to go there for whatever reason. They do have Lindblad in the, of course, kind of firing line as well for that next role at Red Bull in terms of a driver position. I think that's very likely if he does well in Formula 2 this year. But let's talk about the RB21. Yesterday we said a few things that were developing on it, certainly from Pierre Wache, who seemed to imply he wasn't especially optimistic about the progress. Now, this is what Red Bull are trying to do. The concept for the car is done. It's finalized. Now they're going to effectively put it into final production. So this will be Red Bull's final challenger of this era of regulations, and the car that Max will try and use to run a clean sweep across the Drivers' Championships in this era. And the concept is done. I'm sure this is true for most teams as well. Now it's about, final tweaks and execution. And of course, that also comes down to the flexibility of the wings. And we'll discuss that in a second, because it was actually quite a big talking point for Mercedes this year and for Ferrari that they had, Ferrari brought an upgrade. I think it was to Austin. It was not an upgrade they had to declare, because the front wing design was identical to their previous version in terms of the aerodynamic components. It was simply made out of a different composite material that was more flexible, and they gained performance as a result, Ferrari, without technically bringing an upgrade. So it might not be the end of the world for Red Bull if they've designed their concept to say, okay, we can make the front wings more flexible. As we'll discuss in a second, the FIA are saying, look, you guys go ahead and do it. We're not going to stop you, however controversial that might be. But also there's an argument to say that, okay, you make the front wing more flexible, do you not want to change the aero concept slightly to compensate for that? Maybe not, but in an ideal world, probably yes, you would think. So Marco says they are aiming for a wider operating window. That really is what threw them off this season. There were times, Qatar's main Grand Prix, Brazil, and on other occasions, where Max would be the fastest man on track or close to it. I mean, the Austin Grand Prix was a good example, wasn't it? Where in the sprint, Max won the sprint reasonably comfortably. Then they made a few setup changes, the other teams, for the race on the Sunday. Red Bull might have changed a couple of things, and all of a sudden, Max was competitive on the Sunday, but nowhere near winning the Grand Prix. The Ferraris are way too strong. So Red Bull are trying to get better predictability, a consistent performance on more circuits. Apparently, they have resolved their curb handling problems, which did affect them this year, but were reportedly a problem in 2023. Let's not forget, right? I mean, it was a big talking point in that whole season, really, that Red Bull said, oh, well, our car does have weaknesses. Over the curbs in, let's say, Singapore, they struggled with the RB19 that year, and this year that was definitely true again. So obviously, Red Bull can say, oh, yeah, sure, we've solved it, but they kind of were trying to solve that problem last year, because the RB19, as good as it was, had a couple of weaknesses. Over the curbs was one, and this year, if anything, it got worse, didn't it, really, with respect to the opposition. So they're trying to solve that this year, and obviously making the car more consistent in a wider operating window will effectively make it faster. But it's the very difficult balance of these ground effect cars. How much do you chase operating window and how much do you chase performance? Because at some point, you've got to provide some downforce. And Red Bull have been very good at that, but fundamentally they've been very good at providing a very solid aerodynamic concept over the last few years and a platform to build on. The other teams are now getting there with their good aerodynamic base as well. So maybe to some degree it is about downforce in this final year of these set of regulations. And even Marco is not being... It's understandable that Red Bull aren't going to be super headstrong about their progress, but even Marco's saying, well, time will tell whether we've got it right or not, which is not usually what Red Bull would say over the last couple of years. They're usually very gung-ho, but not on this occasion. Just one quick thing before we get into the situation with the FlexiWings, just this comment from Horner on the dynamics between Verstappen and Norris, because I think it would be no surprise next year if these two are again championship contenders. They certainly should be on paper. Norris should take a step. Max is always going to be so difficult to beat, I would say, over the course of a season, unless his car really is not up to scratch. But Horner made this point on the relationship between those guys. We know that in Austria, famously, Norris came out and said, I've lost all respect for this guy if he doesn't apologise. And then they kind of seemed to make up and it was kind of okay. But there's no doubt that their relationship off the track is suffering and will be put under pressure by what's happening on the track, especially after Mexico, where Max was very clear that, yeah, Lando, I get along with you fine outside of the cars, but in the car, I am very ready to put you in the wall if that means I win the championship. And that seemed to catch Lando off guard, that Max, especially to a friend, was willing to go that far. But, that's what the champions tend to do. And Horner said, maybe after the fight, sure, you can be friends, you can be mates, but certainly not in the build-up to it. And I think that's something that Lando's got to learn as well. He can't come out next season and give too much respect to his championship rival. And obviously it depends on the car fundamentally as well. And that depends, to some degree, on whether the cars are either legal or whether they are using the flexibility of their aerodynamic platform in the way that they potentially can. Max Verstappen was hinting the other day about potentially this whole water in the tyres thing. That was a discussion point with McLaren again, saying that he knows for sure that in certain Grand Prix this year they had no chance, no one's ever going to admit it. Maybe, though, that was to some degree to do with the flexibility of the wings. Now, every aerodynamic part, especially made out of carbon fibre or some material like that, has to be flexible to some degree, because otherwise any aero load, it will just shatter. I mean, it would just crack because it would be so brittle. So the car has to bend to some degree. Look at a plain wing. It's not perfectly rigid. It can bend and move around and stuff like that. The same is true for the aero component on a car. But of course, if they flex too much, then the teams can gain advantage by having the rear wing, in McLaren's case, for example, flatten out on the straight, the mini DRS that was talked about. Of course, this was the image of that one here with the flaps moving up at the edge of the rear wing plate. And this was a big talking point in Baku, shortly after Baku, when Piastri won. And, most people would say, hang on a second, this seems a bit too far. And even McLaren themselves said, oh, well, we hold our hands up, we did it, but it was allowed in the rules. because of the way the rules are written. And then they said, okay, we're going to take this wing off the car for the rest of the season. To be fair, they only probably would have used it in Vegas from that point onwards as well, because this was very much so the lower downforce spec of the car in Baku, where Leclerc was not able to make the overtake happen, largely due to the extra 3 or 4 kph that Piastri was getting from this mini DRS as it was being described. Now, the FIA effectively declared this illegal, or at least McLaren agreed to say, okay, we won't use it. We're happy that we caused a stir, but we're going to take it off the car now going forward. And the reason why this is allowed is because when the car is moving very quickly, the aero loads on the aerodynamic parts of the car are not necessarily the same as when they are testing them with no speed at all to determine what they will do at those high speeds. The aerodynamic engineers in Formula 1 are pretty smart people, if you guys hadn't noticed already. Now, the FIA was queried on this, especially by Red Bull, because Red Bull were the team who was trying to exploit flexible wings, and Mercedes and others did it as well, but certainly a few years ago, 2020, 2021, certainly, there was lots of talk on Red Bull exploiting flexibility in their front wing, and certainly other parts of the car as well, to, effectively generate more downforce in the corners and lower the downforce, lower the drag as well on the straights. The FIA was kind of hot on it. They were shutting it down, trying to shut down the flexible wings that were being used, and therefore Red Bull didn't really exploit that too much in the current cycle of regulations. McLaren, however, did. So the answer was expected, I'm sure, from the Red Bull side, that the FIA would say, all right, we're going to clamp down on it, we're going to do further tests, we're going to make sure that these wings aren't as flexible as you guys are currently using. But instead, the FIA have actually said, no, that's not what we're going to do. You guys go right ahead. So the FIA says, look, as long as they pass the tests, they're fine. Now, I think the big point is they have tried to create better tests to ensure that the flexibility they are trying to test for is actually the flexibility that the wing will be capable of when it hits the track. And Tombazis says, we're pretty happy with what we've seen in terms of exploitation of aeroelasticity, is I guess the technical way to describe it. I hasten to say it's not a question of being happy or not, it's also a question of whether you feel that a meaningful test can be made. So look, the FIA, they know what they're doing. They're not idiots over there, at least some of them aren't anyway, and they recognise that it's a challenge to deal with the way that the engineers will try and get around the tests. And they have to decide, okay, we can do a test. Is it actually telling us what we want it to tell us? Because if it's not, what's even the point? Now, he does describe why the front wing is more challenging to test flexibility than the other parts of the car, because he says the front wing loading is so much more varied between cars, depending on the way that they have it designed, with the relation between the front wing and the floor and the rest of the car and all this stuff. So most tests relate to the load of a certain direction, certain position of application, certain magnitude must not produce a certain deformation. The most successful such test imitate as much as possible what happens in real life with the aero loads, and on the earlier wing, for example, it's reasonably successful. But on the front wing, the variety between cars makes that type of idea rather difficult to deploy across the cars, and says that there have been no changes to the test since the current regulations are introduced, and therefore they're not going to change for 2025. Ferrari is understood to have developed its own version of a flexible wing over 2024. We believe that was introduced towards the end of the season, as I mentioned, around about Austin time. And therefore, Red Bull have now the same possibility as well. But of course, they are going to be somewhat behind the curve. Tombazis says there was lots of hoo-ha about it during the summer and in the early autumn. We have made it quite clear to the team since 2022 at least that we are not planning to introduce any further tests on the front wing, and we have stuck to that. So there has been lots of talk about it, but at the end of the day, the FIA have come out and said, look, especially to Red Bull and potentially Ferrari as well, we are not going to change things. If you're able to get away with it in the current tests, that's fine, and that's going to be considered legal within the rules. Because at the end of the day, are McLaren cheating the rules? I mean, you can argue, because their wings flex more than they're allowed to flex, you could argue, based on the letter of the law. But of course, that's not necessarily how it works in F1. Is it flexing more than it should? Yes. Is that illegal? Well, not if it passes the test at ground level. The static load tests, as they describe them as. So, look, as we say, this is from 2021, where Red Bull were doing their best to use some of this technology to their advantage, and now they're in a position where they, maybe have to do it themselves. So this is interesting from a couple of angles, because first of all, it gives Red Bull an opportunity to get better. They weren't really using the flexibility as they could have done last season. McLaren were. Mercedes Mercedes were as well from halfway through the season onwards. And did it really help them? Maybe. It seemed to help Ferrari at the end of the year. There's definitely some benefit to be derived here, and Red Bull will now be able to do that, which will, they'll be happy enough, I guess, that they can do it, but the issue is now they're a bit behind the curve. McLaren have a whole year working with these flexible wings. They know what they can do, they know what they can get away with, they know, how much deformation it can have in the certain loads, and, they're kind of a year on McLaren, and maybe Mercedes and Ferrari as well to some degree in terms of that development. Now, could Red Bull say, okay, the FIA have decided this, we're going to take our current front wing, we're going to make it out of a more flexible material, and we're going to be done with it from there? Maybe, but is that the ideal solution? Potentially not. So, Doc Jobs was talking about this, that they will not be changed because they're being more stringent in the way that they test, but fundamentally they're not going to change the numbers associated with those tests. So, they're pushing that back to 2026. That is, the FIA are going to do something, but they either can't be bothered, or it's too much effort, or they're not sure it would actually work for 2025. So they're basically saying the teams can get on with it and do what they want. I will say the one interesting thing about this is that the other day there was discussion from Mark Hughes about Hamilton at Ferrari and the fact that the changes to the Mercedes that happened when they introduced their flexible front wing in Canada did not help Hamilton, because it meant that the car could be run in a more stable way and deformed less under braking, which is what Hamilton likes to use on the front brakes anyway, in order to get the car turned in and use his speed on the exit and his unbelievable talents in that scenario. If the car is, if it rock and rolls more and the front of the rear has more dive and it has more squat in the suspension, that seems to help Hamilton. And the flexibility of the front wings has meant that that is less relevant to gaining performance in the car. And that potentially has hurt Hamilton. There was talk that Ferrari don't try and set up their car in that way, but there was also discussion that if, let's say, the FIA clamped down hard on flexible wings, that may actually help Hamilton with the car traits that he desires. So this may not be good news for Hamilton, but equally the Ferrari may be a very different car to the Mercedes anyway, that maybe this doesn't matter all that much at the end of the day. But very much interested to your thoughts in the comment section below. Just one final thing to mention for you guys, thought was kind of interesting: overtakes per Grand Prix. These were the numbers in 2024. I guess my question for you guys is there a correlation here between how many overtakes there were and how good the race actually was? Because if you look at some of the best races of the season, I mean, obviously Miami was kind of interesting for multiple reasons. Hungary was entertaining, I suppose. And look, some of these races were good in terms of, some drama, different winners or whatever. Of course, Austria was particularly notable, but that didn't necessarily have much to do with the number of overtakes. For example, Sao Paulo in the rain was an epic race, and it had the 5th most overtakes of the season. But Canada had more, Japan had more, Spain had more, and Las Vegas had the most, again, by quite some margin. And Vegas was, a good race for sure. But was it the best? I don't know. I think there is some correlation here between the races that are the weakest having fewer overtakes, but Great Britain to me was at least the 2nd best race of the season at Silverstone, and that had relatively few overtakes compared to the rest of the calendar. But it's the quality of the overtakes, it's the importance of the overtakes, and fundamentally it's about, was there a fight for the win? That's what matters to me in terms of determining how good a race was. And if there was no fight for the win, then it doesn't really matter how, there could be one overtake, but if it's, the most important overtake in the history of the world for a championship decider and it was an epic overtake with interesting strategy calls or whatever, then that can still be a good race. It's going to be a great race if there's literally one overtake. But I'm not sure how much correlation there really is, but intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below, because it is relevant to some degree, but it's not the be-all and end-all in terms of entertaining races. Although Monaco certainly was an absolute snooze fest, so I'll definitely give you that one. But hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.